The 2020 NFL season is finally almost upon us, so I thought I'd throw out some predictions for what I think might come in the season. Although that being said, probably the boldest prediction that I could make would be to say that the entire season is actually going to happen. But to be honest, I kind of think it's about 50-50 whether or not we're going to get the full season or if we're going to miss some games here and there. But either way, we're going to move forward with the assumption that this is going to be a full season. I am going to be trying to do the entire NFL in this video, so I'm pretty much just going to be picking division winners and going over the divisions at kind of a high level and not doing a deep dive into any of the teams so that we can get through this in a reasonable amount of time. I'll also give you then who I think will be the 3 wildcards from each conference, because remember, we do have 3 wildcards now with 7 teams making it from each side. And I'll also pick the number 1 seed, since those will be the 2 teams that will be getting the first round bye. Alright, but with all that said, let's start with the AFC North, and actually I think this is going to be one of the stronger divisions in the league this year. That being said, I don't know if the Bengals are going to be particularly competitive. I do like Joe Burrow a lot, and I think he has a lot of potential going forward, but I think this year, especially with that offensive line not really having improved a whole lot, he might just have to spend this year trying to survive more than anything else. And the Bengals, well, I don't think they'll quite be as bad as last year, which was pretty much a dumpster fire that got them Joe Burrow in the first place. I don't think that they're going to be competing for even a wild card. They're going to be a back marker in the AFC. With the other 3 teams in the division, I do think these are all 3 playoff contenders. Again, with the Browns, it's pretty much the same story as last year, with it being a pretty talented team that should have the talent to go to the playoffs, but whether or not they can put it all together is a different story, and whether or not Baker Mayfield can perform up to his potential also remains to be seen. With the Steelers, the biggest difference going into this year from going into last year is that their defense is absolutely elite. I think this is a championship level defense, but what it comes down to them is, again, whether or not Roethlisberger can stay healthy, which obviously we saw he didn't last year, and we saw how the team ended up. But even with that being said, even if Roethlisberger does manage to stay healthy, it's pretty clear that he's coming towards the end of his career, and I really don't expect him to be anywhere near the player that he once was. So I do think that for the Steelers, this is going to be them going basically as far as their defense can carry them. But even for as much as I do like the Browns and Steelers and think that they are playoff-worthy teams and totally capable of making the playoffs, they're going to have to do it as a wild card. I just don't see either one of those teams overcoming the Ravens to win the division. I mean, even after having let go of Earl Thomas, who still was one of their better defensive players, even after having given up on a couple of plays towards the end of last season, I just don't see any way that this team can fall back to the other 2. I mean, really what it would take would be a massive regression from Lamar Jackson or an injury to him, which, considering his play style, isn't out of the question, but still, it's not something that you're really going to go into the season expecting. With the AFC East, this is absolutely a 2-horse race. The Jets and Dolphins, I'm sorry, there's just no way that either of these teams are really going to be that competitive. I think the Jets could be a little bit better than they were last year. The Dolphins, I really don't expect that much. I think Tua Tagovailoa is going to be really fun to watch. I hope he stays healthy throughout the season, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not they play him throughout the entire season, whether or not he starts at the beginning. And the Jets, well, they're the Jets, and currently they are the most injured team in the NFL, so that really doesn't bode well going into the season. So again, this division is absolutely a 2-horse race with the Bills and Patriots, and both of these teams have really, really good defenses, but I do think I'm going to give the Bills a little bit of a leg up here and probably end up winning the division, partly because I just really don't like the Patriots and I want to see them fall off the face of the earth, but I'm not expecting them to. I don't think they'll be as good as they have been. This is not going to be the dominating team that we've come to expect, but they're not going to fall off as much as a lot of people are going to hope, even without Tom Brady. Although I do have a lot of questions about Cam Newton and whether or not he can throw it farther than 20 yards, which remains to be seen. I don't know. It'll be an interesting one to see. We do know one thing: Bill Belichick is still the best coach in the NFL, so he's going to have something ready to go, and the Patriots are going to surprise some people more likely than not. And that brings us to the AFC South. And honestly, look, I'm sorry if you're a fan of one of these 4 teams, but I just don't care with this division. I mean, there are some interesting storylines, I suppose. Phillip Rivers obviously is going to be one, seeing whether or not he can look any better than he did last year, which wasn't amazing, to be perfectly honest. It'll be interesting to see him in a different uniform than a Chargers uniform, obviously, but I don't expect a lot from the Colts. The Titans obviously are going to be there. Whether or not they can keep up the magic from the end of last year and somehow roll that over into the start of this season, especially with that running game. If they can get that going again, this could be a really good team, and they could end up winning this division, but we don't know which Ryan Tannehill will get or whether or not he can stay healthy, so that's a big question with the Titans, obviously. with their history of quarterback injuries. Unfortunately for Minshew, though, who I do think absolutely earned his spot as a starter last year, and I think is a starting level quarterback in the NFL, I don't think last season was just a flash in the pan or some kind of crazy one-time performance. I think he is going to be able to sustain it to some extent, but this franchise is honestly just a dumpster fire. There's no way that even if he plays out of his mind that he's going to be able to drag this team to the playoffs. So ultimately, when it comes to picking a winner in this division, I'm just going to go with the team that has the best quarterback, and that is very clearly Deshaun Watson in Houston. So for as much as Bill O'Brien has tried to drive this team into the ground year after year by trading away good player after good player, or maybe I should say great player after great player for next to nothing, I think Houston's still going to end up winning this division, and frustratingly for Houston fans, that probably means that O'Brien keeps sticking around, and who knows who goes next. It could be Watson. So finally, closing out the AFC, that brings us to the West, and obviously the Kansas City Chiefs are winning this division. I don't think anybody in their right mind would pick any of the other teams here. Honestly, this division looks a lot to me like what the AFC East has looked like for a long time, with one very clearly best team and then another maybe playoff team, but probably not, and two teams that really don't have that much of a shot at making the playoffs. Maybe they could surprise some people and get there, but they're not really in that conversation. That being said, I do like a lot of what Denver's been doing in the offseason, and if Locke can show some marked improvement this year, Denver, I think, is a very good candidate for a playoff spot, but it is really going to come down to how Locke performs. As far as the three wildcard teams go, then, I think New England's going to be the easy one for me to pick. They'll be one of those for sure, unless they end up winning the division, in which case Buffalo will for sure fill one of those spots. Outside of New England, though, I think this is going to be a pretty interesting wildcard race for those other two spots. There's a lot of teams here that are in that kind of above average to average range, where they're probably going to be finishing somewhere between 8-8 and maybe 10-6 at the optimistic end, but probably more 8-8, 9-7 type of teams. So I think it probably comes down for those last two spots to some combination of Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Tennessee, and probably Denver. If I had to pick, I would probably say Pittsburgh, because I think they have the best defense of any of those teams. And then maybe Tennessee. I think if they can keep that running game going, I think Tennessee's a really good option. I want to pick Cleveland, I really do. They have the talent to be better than Pittsburgh. They have the talent to be easily the second best team in that division, but they just always find a way to get in their own way. So yeah, I think I'll go Pittsburgh and Tennessee for the last two. So three wild cards. We got New England, Pittsburgh, and Tennessee coming out of the AFC. As far as who the one seed is, I think this is again a two-horse race between Baltimore and Kansas City, just like last year. But that being said, I do think that Kansas City is better set up to repeat what they did last year, more so than Baltimore is. So yeah, ultimately, I don't see it happening for the Bears this year. They're just going to end up getting in their own way and overthinking things on the quarterback position. Meanwhile, the Lions are, well, just kind of the Lions. I mean, sorry, Lions fans, but you know it's true. Honestly, I hope the team gets better. Not as much as you do, but I hope the Lions get better and can become relevant, because I'm sick of the same old in the North. I think that talent-wise, the Vikings might be the best team in this division, even without Stephon Diggs, but they did get Yannick Ngakoue recently, so that's looking pretty good for their defense, which could be a very strong unit as well. But ultimately, this division is somehow going to end up going to the Packers, like it always seems to. I mean, I think at this point we're pretty numb to it and all pretty prepared for another season of the media hyping up all this internal struggle and conflict within the Packers, with Rodgers just deciding that the team hates him all of a sudden and recognizing that they're trying to get rid of him with this new young quarterback that they drafted, and maybe there's more friction between him and the head coach or what have you. But ultimately, Rodgers is still a very, very good quarterback. There's a second year in the system, so any of the kinks that were pretty apparent last year, I think should be able to get worked out. The defense isn't going to be one of the best defenses in the NFL, but it's certainly not going to be the one of the worst ones either. And they do finally have a running game, which they haven't had for the longest time other than the last couple of years. So the Packers, I think, are still the team to beat in the North. And if you do happen to be a fan of one of the other three teams in this division, don't worry, I hope I'm as wrong as you hope I am. So we move on to the NFC East, and once again, this is the division that has been stealing pretty much all the attention from the media between early on with all of the contract issues and whether or not he was going to get a contract and what's going on there, and then a bunch of players testing positive for COVID, and Jerry Jones saying, oh, we're going to play in front of fans no matter what, because that seems like a great idea. And yet somehow even the Cowboys managed to get drowned out by all the craziness that's been going on in the nation's capital. And no, I don't mean politically, I mean with the football team. I mean, honestly, for as much of a mess as teams like the Jaguars and Browns have looked like for the better part of going on a decade now, somehow the Washington football team has managed to outshine them in almost every possible way. I mean, from breaking quarterback after quarterback to telling Trent Williams to not worry about the lump that he has on his head only to years later find out that he had cancer, to all of the stuff that's been going on off the field, this franchise is an absolute dumpster fire. I mean, leave it to Dan Snyder to finally make one good decision, even though his hand was forced and he had said multiple times leading up to it that he would never change the team's name. But he did decide to change the team's name, and yet immediately gets wrapped up in a whole nother scandal that he is very much a part of, regardless of what he wants you to believe. Look, I'm sorry, even if you take him at his word and he wasn't directly involved in any of this, this is still your franchise that you majority own. You better well know what's going on with it, or at least pay enough of attention to be able to listen to these people when things are being brought up and not have it all blow up at once like this. Anyway, none of that really has anything to do with how the team's going to perform on the field, even with a boring, bland name as a placeholder for this year. And I actually do like the numbers on the helmets, but anyway, outside of all that, this is still not going to be a very good team. They're not still the Redskins. They're just them. The Eagles are still a very talented team, and I do think have a very good shot at winning this division, but they do ride pretty much on the health of Carson Wentz, and ultimately, I don't think there's much way of getting around the fact that the Cowboys are the most talented and best team in this division going into the season. I mean, even though they are the Cowboys and Jerry Jones is still very much in charge, I think this team is definitely talented enough to make a push for even the 1 seed. And if that makes you as sick to think about as it makes me to think about, I will say this, I wouldn't worry too much about it because they'll probably still find a way to screw it up in the playoffs. On to the NFC South and what I think is going to be easily the most interesting division to watch throughout this season. Not necessarily the best division, although they do have the potential to be that, but definitely the most interesting. Now maybe it's just because of who I listen to at ESPN Seattle, but I've heard a lot of talk about how the AFC North is the best quarterback division. But honestly, I don't understand how anybody can look any farther than the NFC South as far as the best quarterbacked division. I mean, you have 2 of the best quarterbacks to ever play the game in Tom Brady and Drew Brees. Understandably that both of these guys are coming towards the end of their careers. And you also have another MVP winning quarterback in Matt Ryan in the same division. That team's still not going to be very good in Carolina, and it's going to be a 3-horse race, assuming Atlanta can stay in that race. And I get that the Falcons looked terrible last year, but honestly, I think that was just kind of one of those weird seasons. I mean, we've seen teams continue to win games when it doesn't seem like they really should be winning games, and have a record that's blown way out of proportion to how good the team actually seems to be. And I think Atlanta was a little bit of the opposite of that. Somehow they just kept finding ways to lose games, which, again, a loss is a loss, and you still look bad at the end of the season. But I don't think it was reflective of the talent of the team. So while yes, last year the Falcons were bad and there's no way around it, I don't think that it's going to carry over into this year as much as you would expect from the other teams that were in that level. And while optimistically, I do think that we could have a very fun 3-horse race between 3 very high-powered offenses in Atlanta, Tampa Bay, and New Orleans. I do think that the obvious pick here is New Orleans to win the division. They have been the dominant team in the division for a few years now, and even with Tom Brady and Tampa Bay, I'm still not quite buying into the hype after how Brady looked last year. And that's not to say that Breeze looked overly amazing either, but the supporting cast there is still a little better, even though Brady does have some elite targets to throw to. I will say this though, we're around about a week until the start of the season, and there are still some rumors that Alvin Kamara could end up somewhere outside of New Orleans, and if that's the case, I think I'd be willing to give Tampa Bay the nod to win this division, but until that happens, I'm still going with New Orleans. And to be clear, no, I don't think it's particularly likely that's going to happen. I think that's just people trying to find headlines. So that brings us finally to the NFC West, and what is annoyingly the best division in all of football. I mean, say what you will about the Cardinals, especially after the last couple of seasons that they've had and the fact that their defense still needs quite a bit of help, but the offense showed that they can be a very electric unit last year, especially towards the end of the year as Kyler Murray really started to get going. And now they're coming into the season with a second elite receiver. And now that he's going to be lining up next to an elite talent that can distract defenses like DeAndre Hopkins can, you can only imagine that Larry Fitzgerald is still going to be very relevant in this team. But of course, the focal point outside of whether or not Kyler Murray can continue to improve is going to be DeAndre Hopkins. I think that this is going to be a very dynamic and fun offense to watch, unless of course you're a rival of the Cardinals, in which case it's going to be, well, I can only imagine it's going to be like watching a young Russell Wilson and Seahawks offense come in and just frustrate you to no end. And that's not even to mention what Kenyon Drake can add to that rushing game, who was just another one of those players last year who seemed to leave Miami and then instantly become a very, very good player. And then, of course, all the rest of the division has to offer is the last two NFC champions, and of course the Seahawks, who are always relevant with Russell Wilson. Now, that being said, I just don't know that I expect a whole lot out of the Rams this year. I don't think that last year was an anomaly for the Rams. I think that it was signs that there are serious troubles in LA. I mean, yes, they absolutely still have the best defensive player in the league in Aaron Donald, but the rest of the team just seems like it's heading quickly back towards that mediocre team that they were under Jeff Fisher. Now, they're still very much a more fun to watch team than they were under Jeff Fisher, although he always managed to have some kind of crazy trick play for the Seahawks, but that aside, they're still trying to scrap together a defense after having gone all in on the season 2 years ago. And offensively, they're already without Todd Gurley, so even if he is going to have a resurgence, it isn't going to be in LA, it'll be in Atlanta instead. And especially after last year, the biggest question mark of all is Jared Goff. I mean, he looked great in their run to the Super Bowl, but the one thing that I noticed even during that run, and especially in that Super Bowl, and then again throughout the year last year, is that Goff continues to struggle under pressure. He had a great offensive line in front of him that got them to the Super Bowl, but as soon as that offensive line started to show some holes and things started to get to Goff and get in his face, he really regresses back, not quite to the quarterback we saw his first season, but nowhere near the quarterback that he was leading up to that Super Bowl run. So while talent-wise, I still think this is a very good team and week to week could look like one of the better teams in the NFL, I think that there are enough of those weeks where they just kind of have too many holes that they could even end up falling below Arizona this year. As we get to the Seahawks and 49ers, again, while I think this is overall a very good division and competitive all around the board, I think these are very clearly the two best teams among the four teams that have, all four of them, I think, a decent shot of making the playoffs. But as far as San Francisco and Seattle go, the rivalry is fully back on. I mean, it doesn't quite have the same flame stoking that it did before with Harbaugh and Sherman. I mean, Sherman's still there and he's on the other side now, which is a whole thing. But even at that, Sherman's become at least a little bit more docile in the last few years. I mean, heck, his quarterback threw an interception to seal a loss of the Super Bowl, and he didn't even blame him this time. And to be honest, both of these teams are so good that I think even though they will be watching to see how the Cowboys do, I think that this is a battle not only for the division, but for that first overall seed in the playoffs. For San Francisco, they seem ready to run it back with pretty much the same key players that they had last year. I mean, yeah, they lost a couple of guys on the defensive front, but they added some in their place, so it, for the most part, balances out as far as I'm concerned. Really, the biggest question mark for them on defense is going to be the secondary, and even at that, this is still one of the league's best defenses. It's really going to come down to whether or not they can keep up with the speed at receiver that especially Seattle has, for example. With that being said, they're going to look to cover up any holes in the secondary with an overwhelming pass rush and just getting to the quarterback before anything can happen in the secondary. If they can continue to run the ball the way that they did for much of last year, and especially the games leading up to the Super Bowl and the playoffs, this is still going to be a very potent offense. And it will help open up the secondary in the passing game for Jimmy Garoppolo a little bit, and especially getting the ball to Kittle, who is still absolutely one of, if not the best tight end in the game at the moment. But with that all being said, and I understand that this is still going to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt coming from a Seahawks fan, but I still just don't think that much of Jimmy Garoppolo as far as being one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. I think he's a good quarterback, but not a great quarterback, and certainly not among the elite. And more often than not, he did look good last year, especially when he was passing it to Kittle. But I saw a lot of the same things in Garoppolo last year as I did in Goff the year before that, in that whenever pressure did get to him, he started to have some pretty questionable decision making and some pretty inaccurate throws, which inevitably ended up leading to turnovers and in some cases just straight up missing wide open guys down the field. And honestly, even if he is able to play to the level that he did during the good parts of last year, he's still not going to be getting a whole lot of help from the talent in the receiving core. I mean, yes, he still has Kittle, but the rest of that receiving core is looking pretty sparse. So unless one of these guys kind of just shows up out of nowhere, there really just isn't a lot there. And really for the 49ers as a whole, one of the biggest differences between last year and the year before when they were one of the worst teams in the NFL, which ended up getting them Nick Bosa, is all of the injuries that they had in that season and the injuries they managed to avoid last season. Ultimately, this is still absolutely one of the best teams in the NFL. I'm not trying to say they're not. I was just pointing out that there are still some vulnerabilities there. The Seahawks offseason has been an interesting one, but I think in the end, this team has definitely improved. I mean, especially on the defensive side, understandably, Clowney's not there, or at least at this point as of recording this, Clowney's not there. But bringing in a guy like Jamal Adams has the potential, as I went over in a previous video, to improve the entire secondary. There is a lot of talent in that secondary already. It just kind of hasn't had that keystone guy since Earl Thomas left to really bring it all together. And that is something that Adams could provide. And I understand that he plays safety much different than Earl does, maybe even more similar to how Cam Chancellor did, but having a guy like that in a role like that can still definitely elevate the play of the guys around him. And offensively, the weapons are all there. I mean, Rashad Penny might not be there, but all the other weapons are still there. Chris Carson's back, DK Metcalf is going to be in his second year, which if there's something I'm most excited to see, it's Metcalf in his second season. And of course, Russell Wilson is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. I would say the second best quarterback in the NFL. It's hard not to have Mahomes at number one, but he is certainly one of the two, maybe three best quarterbacks in the NFL. And at this point, I would even say decidedly the best quarterback in the NFC. Even with Rodgers and Breeze and now Brady also in the same conference, I still think that Russell is, with those guys getting more towards the end of their careers, he's the best. And certainly the best quarterback in the division, although I do think Kyler Murray shows some potential. As is, I think, the case for most fan bases of teams that have sustained success, Seahawks fans tend to be outwardly confident, but inwardly pretty nervous about how the team is going to perform going into a season. I am definitely more on the optimistic end of how I think the Seahawks will perform. I think they are absolutely worthy of being one of the best teams in the league going into the year. That being said, though, there are some pretty glaring weaknesses. I do think that, especially after last year, running back depth could be an issue for the Seahawks again this year. But really the biggest issue for the Seahawks is up front. And if you're taking the saying that games are won and lost in the trenches to be 100% true, the Seahawks could be in a lot of trouble. Offensively, yeah, Dwayne Brown's still there, but the rest of that line is once again just a collage of guys they threw together because they need to put somebody in front of Russell Wilson. And defensively, well, Clowney's gone, and I think it was pretty obvious last year just how much of that defensive line he was. And so now at this point, unless Clowney comes back, especially with Yannick Ngakoue in Minnesota now, the Seahawks are pretty much banking on being able to get their pressure from Jamal Adams and their linebackers. Which, to be fair, those guys are very capable of doing from time to time. I mean, Jamal Adams showed it in New York, and Bobby Wagner can do pretty much anything he wants. So there is that, but it does not substitute for having even a passable pass rush. So I guess then, to me, the battle of San Francisco versus Seattle kind of comes down to whether or not you think it's the skill positions that make the most difference in winning the games, or if you think it's the guys up front that make the most difference in winning games. Because if it's the guys up front, San Francisco should win this division without too much issue. And if it's the skill positions, well, Seattle definitely has the edge. As far as I'm concerned, though, I do have to pick one, and I know I'm going to get ripped apart for this for being a homer, but I'm picking the Seahawks, and that's not just because I want it to be true. I actually think the Seahawks are the better team going into the season, because I do think there's some truth to the Super Bowl hangover, and they've got good young talent where they need good young fast talent, and they've got veteran all-pro leadership where they need to have veteran all-pro leadership. And don't forget that even with a, at best, below-average defense last year, Seattle still almost won the division and got that first overall seed. So this isn't, I don't think, too much of a bold prediction to have. Okay, if you've stuck with me through picking the Seahawks to win the division, let's get to the three wildcards. For the NFC, I do think it's a little bit easier to pick than the AFC, with San Francisco, I think, really having to fall apart to get out of the playoffs entirely. Minnesota, again, the very talented team that has a very good shot at winning that division, but probably ends up being a wildcard team. And then, yeah, we'll go with Tampa Bay and Tom Brady, because why not? Tom Brady's always in the playoffs. And I know that leaves out teams like the Eagles and, again, the Falcons, and I guess if you want to consider them the Lions. But honestly, the NFC is just stacked going into this season, and there's going to be a good team that misses the playoffs. As far as the one seed goes, again, I think the one seed's coming out of the NFC West, so that goes between the Seahawks and 49ers, and since I picked the Seahawks to win, I'm going to pick the Seahawks to have the one seed, which that means home field throughout, which, of course, will mean absolutely nothing this year, probably. And I guess since we've come this far, I might as well pick the Super Bowl. And I mean, it's hard to win back-to-back Super Bowls, like really hard. It's hard to even make back-to-back Super Bowls. But there's really only two great teams in the AFC, and I think Kansas City is clearly the better of those two teams. So I think Kansas City's back in the Super Bowl from the AFC side. And from the NFC, Well, I feel like I can't pick the Seahawks or else people are just going to flame me like nothing else. So New Orleans, I think. Well, I think maybe this year we finally get the Super Bowl that everyone wanted and maybe we probably should have had 2 years ago with New Orleans versus Kansas City. And heck with it, New Orleans wins. Why not? All right, that will finally do it for my predictions. Again, the boldest prediction of all is that we're going to get a full season, which, fingers crossed, right? Otherwise, I will have week-to-week predictions, or at least I'm going to try to do week-to-week predictions of the game, so stick with me for those. Otherwise, let me know down and below what you think are some of your predictions for this season going forward, who you think might win some of the divisions, or who you have as your Super Bowl picks. Otherwise, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.